Neither of these works nor this rather untraditional museum appears on our list, but I think it's a good place to review my last lecture and to dive into our next topic, which is environmental or in situ art. That is, art very much tied to a particular place, even when, as in the case of the gates, it's only there for a brief period. What draws our eyes to these abstract minimalist works is not just their stark shapes, but the exquisite natural setting where they've been installed. So before we move on to our first required work, let's pause for a moment and think about the difference that setting can make to art. The Storm King Outdoor Art Museum is located in the Hudson River Valley, about an hour north of New York City. I spent a full day hiking these grounds in 2017. Works by 4 of our required artists are installed in the park. None of these works is required. I've stuck the required work by the artist up in the corner of each slide, but I want to look at these works quickly and to think about how the impact and even the meaning changes when a work is placed outside in the midst of nature. As you'll learn a few lessons from now, this artist was a child in Nazi-occupied Poland and a young adult in Soviet-dominated Poland. Her work focuses heavily on human loss and suffering. Her Storm King sculpture is actually composed of casting molds once used by a European weapons manufacturer. So surely this work is somehow about death, sarcophagi after all, and about war and about vulnerability. What strikes me about this environmental setting is that we see and feel the vulnerability of glass houses and people to objects that might fall from the sky, like bombs from airplanes, for example. This artist is famous as a pioneer of video-based art. Again, stay tuned. I'm going to cheat and read from the museum website. The work features some of the elements typical of Pike's interior and artificial landscapes, scattered televisions, plastic castings of TV consoles, and representations of the Buddha. In Pike's work, television often represents a landscape of contemporary America, assuming a shrine-like role as it does in modern society. Installed outdoors, waiting for a UFO takes on additional significance, suggesting an unanswerable question about the relationship between technology and nature. Old, empty television consoles dropped haphazardly onto the ground appear like technological ruins. Does the work suggest that technology or its waste has overtaken nature, or that it's merged with it? And this is an earth sculpture created by the architect who won the contest to build the Vietnam Veterans Memorial when she was a 20-year-old undergraduate at Yale. She sculpted this using soil and gravel at the site, creating a drainage system and planting it with sustainable grasses. The artist names 2 influences behind this work, both of which you know. Any guesses? The Serpent Mound in Ohio and Japanese dry gardens with their carefully raked piles and paths of stone. And just to round out the full list, here's a work created by Oldenburg and his wife. I actually think it looks less incongruous than most of his works. We're more likely to encounter drainage pipes than giant lipsticks or typewriter erasers when we walk outside. Okay, now we come to our very own Utah artwork. I'm showing you this video clip because it includes footage from a documentary the artist made about the work, and also because it gives you a look at a different work by Christo and Jeanne-Claude. Okay, now that you've seen the video, I should mention that Spiral Jetty is back above water. So just in purely formal terms, where does this work belong? What category? Well, it's minimalist in design and rather abstract, and yet it's set in nature and intended in some ways to mimic nature. The artist also has a political and social purpose. He wants to draw attention to the natural environment and to encourage viewers to venture out into remote places in order to see this art. Just a few more observations. This work of art, like nature itself, changes over time. Salt encrustation has turned the black basalt white. The work is sometimes underwater, sometimes above, and it will probably be reclaimed in time by the lake. The artistic instruments he used were 2 dump trucks, a large tractor, and a front-end loader hired in Ogden to haul the 6,650 tons of rock and earth into the lake. I was curious about the spiral shape. Here's what the College Board says in grading rubric for an earlier question on this work. Smithson was interested in the power of the spiral form, both in nature and in art, long before he arrived at the shores of the Great Salt Lake. Present in forms large and small, spiritual and organic, the spiral is associated with growth, change, and rebirth. But just to complicate matters, here's some information I found on the scientific website discussing this work. In the spiral jetty, the gap between the spiral's curves is kept constant, so it's an Archimedean spiral, not the logarithmic spiral usually found in nature, such as the chambered nautilus, a popular symbol of organic growth. So this further separates Smithson's jetty from the natural world. I've added some College Board comments from a scoring rubric just to round out this discussion. These are sun tunnels by installation artist Nancy Holt, Smithson's wife, and believe it or not, these are also in Utah near Wendover. The sun tunnels are cited to relate the sun at the summer solstice. This harks back to Stonehenge, right? Not required, but more Utah art. On the video, you also saw works by installation artists Christo and Jeanne-Claude. Their stated goal is to promote awareness of the environment, rural and urban, by modifying the landscape with cloth. These environmental art projects are enormously complicated and expensive, especially because they usually require multiple government permits. The artists raise the money for the projects from private sources. So here are a few more of their projects. And since it's a neighboring state, you might be interested to know that a big fight erupted in Colorado over Christo's plan to drape almost 6 miles of fabric over the Arkansas River. The Bureau of Land Management approved the project, and a federal court upheld its approval, but local residents and environmental groups continued to fight this decision, claiming that Christo's art would despoil an area of great natural beauty. Last year, Christo actually pulled the plug on the project, claiming he no longer wanted to work on public lands because Donald Trump was now his landlord. But this raises the interesting question, is environmental art actually good for the environment? Does it draw attention to natural beauty or to mar it? Anyway, here's our required work. I'm hoping you have time to pause for a short essay break. I want you to compare the two works we've just looked at, Spiral Jetty and The Gates. Your question has 2 parts. 1, what is the similarity and a difference between the artist's intention in producing these works? 1 similarity, 1 difference. Back your statement with evidence for the work or what you know of its historical context. 2, what is 1 similarity and 1 difference in the way the viewer perceives these works? You have 10 minutes. So back to the disembodied voice. I'll be reading. I think it's intriguing that Christo's projects are deliberately temporary. Smithson's are not eternal, but he clearly intended the spiral to be there for a long time. And what difference does this make in the viewer's response? What does Christo himself say about this? It was in your reading. But I'd also note that both works invite direct participation by walking a path. Does this remind you of other participatory art? What about circumambulating a stupa or the Kaaba, or moving through the ambulatory in a Romanesque pilgrimage church to visit altars with relics? Something I think you should keep in mind throughout this unit is that contemporary artists sometimes envy and sometimes try to recapture the spiritual power of earlier art. This was in part what attracted Picasso to African masks, not just their clean lines and stylized abstraction, but also the way the wearer assumed a spiritual persona and even a link with gods or ancestors. Many of these artists want to restore this sense of spiritual power or the performance aspect of art, even in a secular age. And this segues nicely into our third work of environmental art, the Vietnam War Memorial. Before we listen to the artist give a short description of her own work, I'd like you to talk briefly about how this work might fit into the tradition of spiritual work, such as stupas, temples, and churches. Now let's hear from Maya Lin. Note that the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial combines minimalism, sculptural architecture, and earthworks environmental art into one, I think, very moving package. It also incorporates words, specifically the names of every soldier who died in the war. You do need to know the controversial history of this work. The reading gave you this background, and so did the video you just saw. I was curious about the original contents. What was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, the nonprofit that sponsored the memorial, actually looking for? So here's what I found. The committee said it was looking for a design that fit these adjectives: harmonious, contemplative and reflective, and conciliatory. The competition booklet concluded with this passage: "We wish to repeat that the memorial is not to be a political statement, and that its purpose is to honor the service and memory of the war's dead, its missing, and its veterans, not the war itself. The memorial should be conciliatory, transcending the tragedy of the war. Maya Lin herself described the memorial as a sculpture cut into the earth like a knife. Others have described it as a wound that is closed and healing, which of course still makes it a wound. The setting is incredibly important. One wall points toward the Washington Monument, the other in the direction of the Lincoln Memorial, both white rather than black, which is a major reason why the memorial sparked so much controversy. Yet the polished black granite's mirror-like surface, which reflects back those who come to mourn and honor the dead, make it possibly Washington's most participative monument. And finally, you need to know the compromise that was finally reached with the memorial's critics, a compromise the architect herself strongly opposed. So these two more traditional statues, one of soldiers, one of military nurses, were erected on the site. So what do you think? Do they detract from the memorial, or do they help heal the wound? Okay, I'm going to admit I've been struggling with how to present our last required work, Narcissus Garden. Let's start with just looking at it as an installation with moving parts. Think about what the guy who made this video is doing and what this might tell you about the artist's intent. So what's he doing? He's looking at mirror balls floating through the water, but he's also looking at himself, reflected in the mirror balls and also in the water. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was a hunter and the son of a river god. He was known for his great beauty and his admiration for his own great beauty. Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution, lured him to a pool where he saw his own reflection in the water and fell in love with it, not realizing it was merely an image. Unable to leave the beauty of his reflection, Narcissus lost his will to live. He stared at his reflection until he died. Narcissus is the origin of the term narcissism, a fixation with oneself and one's physical appearance. So in this garden, we all become Narcissus, right? The installation isn't always created on water, but given the story and water's reflective power, it seems especially appropriate. In some ways, the term narcissism also sums up this artist's career. When I talked about Jeff Koons, I ended up talking more about the artist than his art. It's hard not to do the same for Yayoi Kusama. Like Koons, she is a relentless self-promoter. Like Koons, she straddles the line between mocking art's increasing commercialism and commercializing her own art. Here you see Kusama with her signature polka dot art and the bag she designed for Louis Vuitton. You can get one of those on eBay for about $2,000. Kusama grew up in Japan and was trained in traditional Japanese painting. She also suffered from bouts of what she herself describes as a mental illness that included visions of herself covered with shapes, including her signature polka dot. In 1957, she moved to New York City and became, by turn, an abstract expressionist, a pop artist, and yes, those are what you think they are, stuffed and covered with polka dots, a minimalist, and a promoter of performance art gatherings or happenings. In the photo, the artist is the one who keeps her clothes on. Everyone else gets to wear polka dots. So Kusama became pretty well known in the New York art scene, but she didn't make much money with her art. In 1968, she more or less invaded the Venice Biennale, a very important biennial exhibition of contemporary art that had been running since the late 19th century. She wasn't invited to exhibit. Instead, she set up her mirror balls outside the exhibit and sold them to passers-by. The trick gained her a lot of attention, some would say notoriety. In 1973, the artist moved back to Tokyo, and in 1977, she was admitted to a mental institution where she's continued to live when she isn't attending the increasingly successful exhibitions of her work or selling her fashion accessories. If you have time, I think you might enjoy this BBC interview with the artist.